Hi, welcome back to the channel, and thank you so much for joining us for this episode. Today, I am going to share a data-backed story with you, a narrative distilled from 25 years of global shifts and financial analysis. For most of us, wherever we live in this world, we share something in common. War means one thing: a brutal clash, the failure of diplomacy, when politics runs out of words. It's driven by land, power, money, ideology, and so on and so forth. We picture soldiers, tanks, bombs, drones in the sky, and the cost is always the same: death, destroyed cities, families torn apart, refugees with nowhere to go. War feels like chaos, tragedy, and loss. And every day, this common sense is reinforced through headlines, breaking news, endless images on our screens. Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, Ukraine, and recently Venezuela, Iran. Each story pulls us into the same loop: shock, then anger, then sympathy, until the world feels simple again. Good versus evil. Right versus wrong. But what if this isn't the whole picture? One day, I stepped away from the headlines, from the emotions, and looked somewhere else, at public data released by government authorities and institutions, at financial reports. And a different view of war began to appear, not on battlefields, but on financial performance reports and balance sheets. To understand how war connects to business, we need to start with one simple number: money. In 2024, global military spending reached a historic record: $2,650 billion. That's how much 175 countries spent on their militaries in just 1 year. Among all nations, one country stands far above the rest: the United States. In 2024 alone, the US spent $997 billion on defense. That's nearly $1 trillion. It accounts for 38% of total global military spending. In other words, more than 1 out of every $3 spent on the world's militaries came from the United States. Now, let's look at the bigger picture. The top 10 military spending countries, the United States, China, Russia, Germany, India, the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, Ukraine, France, and Japan, together spent $1.98 trillion. That's 75% of all military spending on Earth. And here's the part that often goes unnoticed. The United States alone accounts for more than half of that top 10 total, more than the other 9 countries combined. Among these top spenders, 2 nations are locked in direct, ongoing war: Russia and Ukraine, a conflict that has lasted for nearly 4 years and continues to demand enormous military budgets year after year. These numbers aren't opinions, they aren't narratives. They are budgets, and budgets show us something important. War is not only fought on the battlefield, it is also sustained, funded, and expanded through money. Military spending doesn't grow by accident. Behind every budget line, there is a policy, and behind many of those policies, there is influence. In 2024, U.S. defense companies spent more than $157 million on federal lobbying. Over 1,000 lobbyists were involved. Their job was simple: to talk to lawmakers, shape regulations, and influence how national security decisions are made. Major firms like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Boeing were among the most active, and the stakes are high. For Lockheed Martin, 96% of its revenue comes directly from government contracts. When government spending rises, business rises with it. But lobbying is only one part of a broader framework. Defense companies also rely on what is often called the revolving door. Former government officials move into senior roles inside defense firms, while industry executives are appointed to advisory positions in government. Experience flows both ways. So does influence. Political donations add another layer. Contributions to election campaigns help ensure access and long-term relationships with decision-makers. Then there are think tanks and research institutions. Many receive funding from the defense industry, producing reports that frame security challenges through military solutions. Another major focus is foreign weapons sales. Defense firms actively lobby the U.S. government to approve and facilitate arms exports, turning global conflict zones into expanding markets. And finally, there are earmarks, specific budget allocations written directly into legislation, guaranteeing funding for particular weapon systems. None of this happens in secret. It happens through legal, structured, and institutionalized channels. And the result is clear. When policy becomes militarized, war doesn't just respond to politics, it begins to shape it. To understand how war reshapes business, we need to step back and look at time. Not days, not headlines, but 25 years. Since the early 2000s, the world has entered an almost continuous cycle of conflict. And over that same period, the world's largest defense companies didn't just survive, they expanded. In 2024, the combined defense revenue of the top 15 defense firms reached a level 5.5 times higher than it was before 9/11, a 556% increase. This growth did not happen in a vacuum. It unfolded alongside a sequence of major wars, each leaving deep scars on societies and clear marks on balance sheets. Let's place them on the same timeline. In the late 1990s, the Kosovo War marked one of NATO's first large-scale military interventions after the Cold War. Ethnic violence, air campaigns, hundreds of thousands of refugees. It was a signal that large-scale military operations were not over. Then came September 11, 2001. The attacks reshaped global security priorities overnight. Within weeks, the Afghanistan War began. It became the longest war in U.S. history. Trillions of dollars spent, 2 decades of sustained military demand, constant requirements for aircraft, armored vehicles, surveillance systems, drones, logistics, and munitions. For defense firms, this was not a spike, it was a structural shift. Just 2 years later, in 2003, the Iraq War opened another front. A rapid invasion, followed by years of insurgency, occupation, and civil conflict. New needs emerged: counterinsurgency equipment, urban warfare systems, missile defense, private military logistics. As violence intensified, contracts multiplied. Defense revenues climbed, not once, but year after year. In 2011, instability spread again. The first Libyan civil war erupted, and almost immediately the Syrian civil war followed, a conflict that would last more than a decade. Multiple factions, foreign interventions, advanced weapons flowing in from all directions, entire cities destroyed, millions displaced. Meanwhile, defense manufacturers continued scaling production, meeting demand from governments far beyond the battlefield itself. Then came the rise of ISIS between 2014 and 2019. A new type of war, fast-moving, asymmetric, fought with airstrikes, intelligence systems, drones, precision weapons. Campaigns expanded across Iraq and Syria. Defense firms adopted quickly, supplying technologies designed for persistent surveillance and rapid deployment. Revenues accelerated again. And then in 2022, the world crossed another threshold. The full-scale Russia-Ukraine war began, the largest conventional conflict in Europe since World War II. Tanks, artillery, fighter jets, missiles, air defense systems consumed at a pace unseen in decades. Military stockpiles drained. New orders surged. Long-term production contracts returned. By this point, the pattern was no longer subtle. Since 9/11, nearly every major escalation in global conflict has aligned with new phases of revenue expansion for the world's largest defense firms. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, BAE Systems, Boeing, Thales, Leonardo, and Airbus on one side, Rostec, Norinco, CASEC, CSSC, and other state-linked giants on the other. Different countries, different political systems, but a shared outcome. Bigger wars meant bigger balance sheets. Among them, General Dynamics stands out. Over the past 25 years, its defense revenue surged by 777%, the highest growth rate among its peers. More submarines, more armored vehicles, more long-term contracts. War after war, the numbers kept rising. This does not mean wars are started because of defense companies, but it does reveal something harder to ignore. In the modern world, war has become more than a geopolitical event. It has become a reliable growth environment for a specific group of firms, operating at global scale over decades. When we place wars and revenues on the same timeline, we don't see randomness. We see structure. Up to this point, we've looked at growth. Now we look at scale. Since the year 2000, spanning the period before and after 9/11, the top 100 defense companies in the world generated a combined $10.1 trillion in defense-related revenue. $10.1 trillion. Not projected, not estimated, recorded revenue. To put that number into perspective, it is larger than the annual GDP of most countries on Earth. This is not a niche industry. This is a global economic pillar, and it is not evenly distributed. When we break down that $10.1 trillion by country, one player dominates the landscape: the United States. US-based defense firms captured 58.3% of all defense revenue earned by the global top 100. That equals $5.87 trillion flowing through American defense companies alone, more than half of the entire global total. Behind the US, the United Kingdom and China follow, but at a distance. The gap is not narrow, it is structural. Now zoom out further. Those 100 defense firms come from 35 countries, but revenue concentration tells a very different story. The top 10 countries together generated $9.5 trillion in defense revenue. That is 94.5% of the total, which means the remaining 25 countries combined share just 5.5% of the market. In other words, global defense revenue is not just concentrated, it is compressed. A handful of countries dominate a business that is fueled by wars occurring far beyond their own borders. Now let's move from countries to companies. Among the top 100 defense firms, the top 10 companies alone generated $4.9 trillion in defense revenue since 2000, nearly half of the entire total, captured by just 10 firms. And 6 of those 10 are American companies. This is not simply scale. This is industrial concentration. At the very top of this hierarchy sits one company, Lockheed Martin. Since 2000, Lockheed Martin has generated $1.08 trillion in defense revenue. That is 10.8% of all defense revenue earned by the top 100 firms worldwide. One company, one out of every $10. Think about what that implies. Every major US-led conflict since 9/11, every long-term procurement program, Every replenishment cycle leaves a measurable imprint on corporate income statements. This revenue did not arrive in a single surge. It accumulated year after year, war after war, contract after contract. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, ISIS, Ukraine. Different justifications, different geographies, but the same financial mechanism. Long wars create long demand curves. Ammunition must be replaced, equipment must be upgraded, stockpiles must be rebuilt. And when conflicts overlap, those curves stack. What emerges is not a temporary boom, but a persistent revenue engine. To be clear, this does not mean defense companies control foreign policy, but it does mean that war has become deeply embedded in corporate growth models. For these firms, war is not an anomaly. It is a planning assumption, a baseline scenario. When we step back and observe the numbers as a whole, one conclusion becomes unavoidable. Modern war operates on two levels at once. On the ground, it destroys lives, cities, and futures. On balance sheets, it generates scale, predictability, and concentration. $10.1 trillion is not just a statistic, it is a signal that war in the 21st century has become more than a geopolitical event. It has become a global business system. So far, we've looked at history, at decades of accumulation. Now, let's pause here and look at one single year, 2024. In that year alone, the top 15 defense companies in the world generated a combined $425.6 billion in defense revenue. $425.6 billion in just 12 months. To understand how concentrated this is, consider this. The entire top 100 defense firms earned $687.5 billion in 2024. Which means the top 15 alone captured 62% of all defense revenue worldwide. A small group controlling the majority of the market. At the very top once again stands Lockheed Martin. In 2024, Lockheed Martin recorded $68.4 billion in defense revenue. That single company accounted for 9.9% of the entire global top 100. Nearly $1 out of every 10. Now look at geography. Among the top 15 firms, 6 are US-based companies. Together, they generated $364.8 billion in defense revenue. That is 53% of the top 15 total. And for these companies, defense is not a side business. On average, 75% of their total revenue comes directly from military and defense contracts. This tells us something important. By 2024, the defense industry is no longer expanding quietly in the background. It is operating at scale, with concentration, and with remarkable consistency. War may dominate headlines for months, but for these firms, defense revenue flows every quarter, predictable, recurring, and structurally embedded in the global economy. We've seen the revenue. Now let's look at the price tags behind it. Defense firms don't just sell ideas. They sell machines. Machines that cost tens, hundreds, even billions of dollars. Take the F-35 fighter jet, built by Lockheed Martin. One single jet, depending on the model, costs between $82 and $109 million. That's roughly the annual income of 1,000 average families, packed into one aircraft. Russia's Su-35 fighter jet, produced by Rostec, comes in at around $85 million per plane. A leap beyond even that, the B-2 stealth bomber from Northrop Grumman is valued at a staggering $2.1 billion. And then there's the Virginia-class attack submarine, crafted by General Dynamics, each one costing at least $4.3 billion. Rockets, missiles, interceptors, tanks, radars, every piece is another revenue engine. Multiply these numbers across fleets, contracts, and decades, and you begin to see why defense firms can generate hundreds of billions year after year. These are not just weapons, they are the money printers of the defense industry. In wars that drag on or in preparation for potential conflicts, these machines become predictable revenue streams, flowing into balance sheets, fueling growth, and reinforcing the cycle of military spending. Numbers alone are abstract, but when you tie them to real machines, real jets, real submarines, real missiles, the scale hits differently. For defense firms, every contract, every plane, every submarine, every missile is more than a product. It is a financial engine. And this is the part of war we rarely see, the part that turns global conflict into a massive, lucrative business. After exploring the data, looking at military spending, revenue growth, and the staggering price of weapons, one insight becomes clear. War is not just tragedy. It is also an economic engine, at least for a small group of companies or countries. On one plane, war brings fear, death, displacement, and suffering. Humans pay the highest cost, with families shattered, cities destroyed, and lives forever altered. On the parallel plane, war drives enormous financial flows. Defense firms grow, governments allocate billions, and economic interests shape policy decisions. These two planes, human tragedy and economic engine, coexist, intertwined, and rarely examined together. The growth strategies of defense companies, the contracts, lobbying, and weapons production do not exist in isolation. They become part of the geopolitical environment, influencing decisions, prolonging conflicts, and shaping the future of warfare. This perspective does not explain every war, nor does it diminish the suffering of those affected, but it reveals a dimension often overlooked: the economic forces that ride alongside human conflict. Understanding war in this dual lens challenges what we think we know. It asks us to see the invisible layer beneath the headlines, beneath the explosions, the battles, and the stories of courage and loss. And while no single analysis can capture every facet of war, the data shows us this undeniable truth: war is both human tragedy and strategic business. These planes reinforce each other, shaping the world in ways most of us never imagine. Seeing war this way gives us a broader perspective, one that is uncomfortable but necessary. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting and informative, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. And please subscribe for more interesting infographic-based analysis.